all these diets and cleanses and all this stuff that people, maybe they work temporarily, maybe there's a placebo effect, but in the long run, could do more harm than good.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Uncovery podcast. My name is Maddie, and I'm recovering from anorexia, and to talk about it on this podcast. We are about to jump into a very cool interview that I did with Dr. Dodell, but I just thought I'd do a little check-in off the top. How are things? Things are feeling a bit better this week. You will have heard kind of in the in the group therapy episode was a bit of an attitude problem, I think. And I was just feeling pretty bleh, and I was going into group feeling bleh, and I was just, I was feeling kind of overwhelmed, and I was feeling kind of struggly the last couple of weeks. And so what I did was double up on all of my therapy. So I'm going to see my therapist today for the second time this week, which feels excessive at this point in recovery, right? Like you should be, I don't know, I'm telling myself like you should be beyond this. You should be further through this. You shouldn't need as much support, but it feels like this very critical time that I actually do. And so instead of running away, I am just taking it head on because I am not fucking around. I'm not fucking around. I'm going to recover. So I have no choice. I have to make sure that I'm doing all of the things that I know are going to help. So that's kind of the headspace this week. It really helps to go to therapy. I know that this feels like a given, and I know that people that don't go are like, okay, yes, that's nice for you. But I genuinely believe that everybody should at least try it and just see what comes up, see how you feel after. It's a game changer. I would recommend it. No pressure, but I would seriously recommend it. Okay. This week, we are talking about hormones, and I know that there are lots of hormones in the body and that they are probably all impacted by eating disorders, but the ins and outs of which parts of you are part of your endocrine system and how that's impacted when you are restricting food and putting your body under a lot of stress, I don't really understand all of the ins and outs of that. And especially as I'm in recovery and these things are starting to come back online, I really wanted to figure out what the heck is going on inside. So Gregory Dodell is a board-certified endocrinologist. He received his medical degree from Albany Medical College. He completed his internal medicine and endocrinology fellowship at St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital Center, affiliated with Columbia University. He's a president of Central Park Endocrinology. And he also has a really fun and interesting and informative Instagram page, which is how I actually found him, where he posts a lot about different things regarding health and stigma and mental health and how it impacts the body. So without further ado, I bring you the interview. Dr. Greg Dodell, welcome to the Uncovery podcast.
Thank you. I'm excited to chat with you.
So I really just want to dive in because I think there's a lot of ground to cover here. And the more that I read about the endocrine system, the more I'm thinking of questions for you. But to give us a little bit of background, who are you and what do you do?
Okay, so my name is Greg Dodell. I am a private practice endocrinologist in New York City. And endocrinologist, I mean, when I meet people at parties or wherever, events, they're like, endocrinology, what exactly do you do? So it's not uncommon that people don't know. I basically say we deal with hormones. So, and then I say diabetes and thyroid and PCOS and osteoporosis, things like that are all the endocrine system. And those are the conditions that I see and help treat.
Okay. And So I mean, I stumbled upon your content online on social media, and you have some really wonderful content around, inclusive medicine, and specifically you talk about sort of disordered eating, and there's some pieces in there, and I was really excited to see that because I think it's something that we don't necessarily all understand what the impacts of eating disorders and disordered eating are on all of our body symptoms and body systems. So I want to understand sort of what drew you to sort of enter that space.
Good question. I am fortunate enough to be married to a psychologist who does work in that space, Alexis Conason, who wrote a book on this kind of topic called The Diet Free Revolution. So for 10 years or more, she's been kind of talking to me about health at every size and what she sees and talks about with her clients who have been on kind of this diet cycle and all the stuff that goes on in culture and society, and just being so enmeshed and trained in the traditional medical community. It was just very hard for me to wrap my head around it. And then finally it just clicked and I did. And just seeing more and more patients who have struggled, having these conversations with physicians and not wanting to go to doctors because of such a weight focus. And yeah, and so I started reading about it and looking at research on weight stigma and weight cycling and how poorly diets work long term and mostly fail. So just all that stuff helped me to approach medicine this way, and hopefully it's helping people. And that's why I also wanted to jump on and do it on social media, because it is such, a really unique perspective and a unique approach from an endocrinologist.
Yeah, that's what I found, and that's why I, found your content so exciting and illuminating, because I don't think that a lot of physicians take these positions or have the training or seek out that sort of perspective on a more holistic body view of things like diets and disordered eating. So I want to take a little bit of a step back, because I know that it's definitely probable that people don't know the ins and outs of what kind of encompasses the endocrine system, and specifically what happens to these systems when we're restricting food or having sort of a disordered relationship with food in our bodies. Can you talk a little bit about those interplaying systems and what we see when people start to restrict or kind of fall down that rabbit hole of disordered eating?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So a lot of the endocrine system could be fight or flight based. So things like glucose values, cortisol, insulin levels, even, the hormones that affect sexual function, reproductive stuff, that's all impacted by stress and the way we're treating our body, whether, we're nourishing it, whether we're getting rest, whether we're getting movement, all those things play a role. So if someone is restricting and not nourishing themselves, it throws the body kind of into overdrive where, evolutionarily speaking, like running from the lion or the tiger in the woods, you're not going to be in a reproductive state. Your blood sugar is going to be high, potentially the blood pressure. All these variables are going to be thrown kind of into survival mode rather than like a rest and digest type, situation, which is more the parasympathetic nervous system. So it really affects the whole body. And that's what I love about endocrine, is that it's not just one organ system. It's really the hormones affect everything, in our day-to-day life and our well-being. So undernourishing ourselves definitely has a huge impact on that whole system.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So maybe let's kind of unpack the different sort of elements that I'm hearing of these different systems, and what kind of happens when we are in sort of a state of, like you said, stress or restriction
Hmm.
or things like that. Let's talk about what happens to hunger, and maybe you could talk about hunger hormones and how that system kind of works.
Hmm. So I love the research on sleep and the impact of appetite and hormones in general. And maybe that's a good way to look at it, because if you're not well rested, that is a state of stress. So there's a lot of research on, if people aren't getting enough sleep, the impact that it plays. So for example, there's one study that I'm aware of where they took college kids who had no health problems whatsoever. They sleep deprived them for, I don't know, call it a week, I think it was. only let them sleep for 5 hours a night for a week. And then they checked all the different hormone levels like blood sugar and cortisol levels and insulin and thyroid, and all these things were really thrown out of whack. And then a couple weeks later, they let them kind of catch up on the sleep and they all corrected themselves. So appetite is one of the hormones that they looked at. And appetite hormones, which are basically ghrelin, is one of them, which makes us feel hungry. And then leptin, which is the hormone that makes us feel full. Those things were all changed a lot by not getting enough sleep. And the same thing could be said, if you're under stress, the body is going to do everything it can to fuel itself. And that means increasing ghrelin levels and also causing potentially insulin resistance, which is keeping the blood sugar a little bit higher and more readily available because the body's in a state of stress.
Right. And so I'm hearing that obviously physical stress and something like lack of sleep or lack of nourishment would put all of those hormones out of whack. Something that I think of when I think about eating disorders or disordered eating is that people, when they're sort of renourishing, sometimes we get something that's called extreme hunger. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like this mental insatiability that you're feeling. And does that come from, mental stress and the same stress that we would feel physically, but mental stress could have the same impact on those hormones of the like really not feeling the correct amount of hunger cues, fullness cues, and things like that?
Yeah, I'm not sure about the research on that, but I guess I could extrapolate and say that if someone spent a long time restricting and not getting enough calories, essentially, that once they start reintroducing foods, just the same way that the appetite hormones may be a bit dysregulated and take time to kind of recalibrate, I assume also, mentally, emotionally, all those things also have to kind of recalibrate because it's spent so much time focusing on restricting that once you kind of like allow yourself to reintroduce those foods, I think there's obviously, mental and emotional component that comes with it also.
Right, right. Okay. Now, something that I think a lot of people that have, been through different types of diets or disordered eating or eating disorders, there's this fear that when you've done something like restrict food or cycled different amounts of food over a large period of time, that you can break your metabolism or that your metabolism sort of down regulates to a point where it can't be fixed. Is there anything you can tell us about, how hormones and metabolism interact?
Yeah, I mean, we all have a metabolic set point, which is kind of this window of where our body's mostly genetically predisposed to be at a certain weight, give or take, some percentage points up and down. And it's possible that, I don't know. I don't really know, to be honest with you, if it resets our set point or not. But I can say that when you go below that set point, the body does basically do everything it can to protect that set point, such as increasing ghrelin levels, decreasing satiety, things like that, to try and keep us in that window. And that's why historically diets don't work because when people lose a certain amount of weight, the body does everything it can to get more calories to get back to that set point. And I assume the same thing is true with people that are restricting. And then as you reintroduce foods again, the body's going to try and get back to that set point whatever way that it can.
Right, right. And I think that sort of helps support, what at least I hope we know, which is that, when we are just trying desperately to restrict food or people are trying to diet and they feel crazy, we feel crazy because it's not that we don't feel like eating. It's not that we don't want to eat. Actually, everything inside of us is physically, mentally, emotionally, crying out to renourish, to sort of get back to that set point. And then you just have to work so, so, so hard to sort of restrict yourself into this body that really you're not meant to be in at all.
Right. And I have patients that have had years and years of eating disorders and it's been across different life stages. So when they do go into recovery, they potentially don't know what their body really is even supposed to be programmed at and look like and feel like and all these things. So then it's kind of like, well, am I think they kind of feel like, am I overdoing it? And now I'm like above what my set point should be. And that's maybe where you're getting at with this question of like, can you mess up your metabolism? And I don't know if we really know, because if someone's been restricting for a long time, we don't really know what the baseline is, once they nourish
Right.
themselves. So it's like you don't have like an accurate comparison of like what it was beforehand, potentially. And then also, our bodies change over the course of our life. So even if someone's nourishing themselves and has a good relationship with food and movement and all that stuff, the body's still going to change. So it's like if the restriction crosses over some of these times and all this stuff, you don't really know what your body would have been had you not restricted. So it's really complicated. And obviously, like, people that are going into recovery, that's like a whole other added element of like, did I mess up my metabolism?
Right.
And I think we have to be in the present moment and trust, our body and what it's doing once you go into, hopefully a healthier relationship with food.
Yeah. And I think that that is such an important point that bears repeating, that if you've basically intervened on yourself by restricting or falling victim to an eating disorder at some point, you've sort of missed out on what was going to be sort of a normal development, no matter what age you are at. Because as you say, the body sort of changes and goes through cycles all throughout your life. So it's almost like when we think about recovery, we're actually like, we're not even really sure where we were supposed to be this whole time anyway. And so much of it is this leap of faith of, where am I going to end up? I feel really uncertain about what my quote unquote recovered body, or my Maddie size. What does a Maddie size body look like? I have no idea, because I intervened on it and I don't know where I would have ended up. So there's a lot of sort of stress and mental anguish that kind of comes along with that uncertainty that you're also working on as your systems, your physical systems, are recovering as well. So I want to kind of talk about fertility, because I
Mm-hmm.
know that that's such a hormonal related experience. I mean, when I think about like an endocrinologist, I'm like, there is nothing that you don't do and have expertise on, because this is like every single thing that our bodies are wired to go through in our life. It's impacted by the endocrine system. But fertility is a huge thing that we kind of talk about in the eating disorder space, because when you've down regulated your system so much that your body's in this fight or flight mode, often we lose our periods, we become infertile, at least periodically. How does that sort of start to come back online? Like, how does that all happen and start to repair itself after a period of restriction?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I generally say menstrual cycle reproduction is a good kind of surrogate marker for how the body is in balance in general. And as we've been alluding to, if the body's under stress, it's not going to be thinking about reproduction. It's going to be thinking about like, how am I going to survive, you know? And which makes sense, right? Because you're not in a state where you would potentially be able to have fertility because your body's under stress, so a lot of the hormones that regulate the menstrual cycle, specifically like LH and FSH, and even leptin, which is a hormone that makes us feel full, those things are dependent on having a certain amount of fat in the body, so, and being nourished. So if someone's undernourished, those hormones in the pituitary gland, specifically LH and FSH, are downregulated and become low, and won't generate a cycle. And as people re-nourish themselves, you should potentially see those hormones come back up, towards baseline to help regulate the cycle.
Mm. Okay. And so on that sort of that body fat need, I've heard that, this sort of fat is a hormone generating piece of your body, but I'm not entirely sure how that works. So are hormones actually being developed in your fat stores, or is it just that your brain needs to know that there are fat stores in order to release those hormones? What's the relationship there?
So estrogen's really tied in with fat cells. There's a hormone called aromatase that converts testosterone to estrogen. In fat cells also impact the immune system, blood flow, a whole host of things. Which I had a post on Instagram. I don't remember all the details of it, but it's fat's basically an endocrine organ,
Mm.
and it has a lot of interplay and balancing out our system. And there's a lot of different kinds of fat. There's subcutaneous fat, there's visceral fat, which is like more like the abdominal fat. So fat fat has a lot of important roles in the body, and if there's not enough, that can throw the body into a stress state as well. And as we're talking about with reproduction.
Right, right. So without that, your brain is essentially like, look, we're going to focus on the critical things, and we're going to have to slow down or stop all of the sort of reproductive pieces, for example.
Yeah, I mean, even like um overdoing it with exercise can have the same effect, you know. I see both men and women who have maybe been training for marathons or professional athletes or whatever, and that certainly affects testosterone, estrogen, fertility, all of those things, because the body's perceiving it like under stress or training, low body fat, all those things play a role.
Right. So, I mean,
So, and
what
you know,
a,
that's
yeah.
why I come back to, it's just like saying that it's a pretty good marker, you know, at least in women, we have that marker about the menstrual cycle, that if that is imbalance, that's a pretty good indicator that the rest of the hormone endocrine system is also imbalanced.
Right. And so, yeah, so sort of on that topic, I guess, when you're seeing men, and I know that while eating disorders maybe are not as common, I also just think that they're extraordinarily underreported. And I think that sort of like the diet and exercise mentality for men is just as rampant in a very different way than it is for women. How do you sort of broach that with male clients? And because we don't have markers like a menstrual cycle, what do you look to in sort of your male clients?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to make this clear, you know, off the bat, that I'm not an eating disorder specialist.
Of course,
I'm
yes.
I'm an endocrinologist, so you know, I see people that have histories of eating disorder or maybe struggling with an eating disorder, but they're not seeing me as like their primary support for that. But because of what I do as an endocrinologist and all the things that we're talking about, there is like that overlap. So in men too, if they're coming to me, I guess the other marker, the marker that I look at in men is testosterone, because if they're coming to me and saying, hey, you know, I have really low libido, I'm having problem with erections, whatever, then can you check my testosterone? I think it may be low, and I check it and it's low. That's when I would talk about things like, well, are you overdoing with exercise? Are you getting enough nutrition? Are you getting sleep? Are you managing your stress? All the things that I talk about people with in general, but certainly all those factors play a role in men, with regard to testosterone and potentially sexual function and libido.
Right, right. Yes, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. There was something that I was looking at that I didn't know that bones and bone health were such an integral part of sort of endocrinology as well. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because so for example, you know, bone loss is something that we see when people are undernourished in a lot of cases. I'm working on building back my own bone health after kind of falling into this osteopenia category a couple of years ago. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that and the interplay between hormones and bone health.
So both estrogen and testosterone are important for bone health, and that's why you see, commonly in postmenopausal women or women that aren't having a consistent menstrual cycle, that bone loss occurs, because estrogens are really important for maintaining bone, and that's why we see it. And obviously, also calcium, vitamin D, all those are important as well. So if someone's undernourishing themselves and not getting good sources of nutrition, that can impact bone as well. And then other things, even like thyroid, and there's an overlap too with diabetes and insulin. So all these things impact bone the same way that, you know, fat does, and all these different major organ systems in our body all interact with hormones.
Wow.
They're not
Wow.
just like inert, like skeletal function or protective layers of fat. You know, they all have cellular signaling and mechanisms and talking to one another and keeping us in balance.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So I've also heard or I've read about PCOS, and I've not I don't know very much about it, but I've read that it can be more common in those with eating disorders or having come out of eating disorders. And I'm not sure if that's true, but could you explain what PCOS is and what the implications are of it?
Sure. I'm not familiar with any data that would say that it's more common in people with eating disorders.
Okay.
I could be totally wrong on that, but what I would say is maybe someone who has PCOS or a genetic susceptibility to PCOS, because of a lot of it could be even just stigma that happens in society in the medical community, because people with PCOS have what's called insulin resistance. And again, that occurs across the size spectrum, but insulin is the hormone that regulates blood sugar. And if there's this, what we call insulin resistance, it means that the body's not able to process sugar in the same way. And that can increase other hormones like testosterone, which can affect metabolism. It can affect hair and skin and the menstrual cycle and all these things. And there's a bit of a delayed diagnosis, that we hear about in the medical community and from patients. And there's potential stigma from it because they may be in larger bodies, or they may have been, metabolically, told about things, and that stigma and whatever may lead to eating disorders. So if anything, I would say that PCOS,
Ah,
having PCOS and the experience of having PCOS in the world, maybe, I mean, I'm just hypothesizing, could predispose someone to eating disorder. Like I've seen patients who have, this quote unquote insulin resistance or high blood sugar growing up, like, in kids, the pediatrician or in high school or whatever, someone says, oh, you have high blood sugar, you should really, exercise more and eat differently and whatever they say, which ends up being more harmful than not. And then
right.
they go on a restrictive diet, and, that creates a lot of issues. So possibly, that's what's related and what's going on.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So just, maybe there's some correlation, but the directionality of the causation is, yeah, it remains to be seen, I guess.
Right.
Um, so with adrenals, I wanted to talk about adrenals with you because I have heard, I think we all hear this sort of, I don't know, this narrative about adrenals, adrenal fatigue. I know it's a really integral part of the endocrine system, but can you talk, like, is adrenal fatigue a real thing? Is that real?
I would say no. And I think 99.9% of endocrinologists would agree. And I think that's something that's maybe just been put out there in, social media and people selling, adrenal support supplements and things like that. Adrenal fatigue, I would say as an entity of itself is not real, but I would say that the impact of stress and not getting enough sleep and all those things, which I think they're saying it causes adrenal fatigue,
Mm-hmm.
those things are real for sure. I mean, but it doesn't mean that our adrenals aren't working. It just means that all the things that we're saying, that stress and not getting sleep and all those things impacts our endocrine system, but it doesn't mean that our adrenals are fatigued or not working and things like that.
Okay, that helps because it almost it has this same sort of color to it as the like diet culture talk, right? Like these sort of like
Correct.
holistic, people that think that they're working on your health and they're telling you that like I've been told that my adrenals were fatigued by, a sort of holistic naturopathic type of
Right. Right.
professional.
Right.
And
Right.
I'm like I'm trying to read about this and there's so much conflicting information in that health realm, and I'm sure that you run into a lot of debunking when you see clients that are struggling and have been told certain answers that end up not being true or aren't helping. Is that something that you run into a lot? Do you have to do a lot of debunking in your work?
Yeah, I mean, I try not to put down other professionals, but when I have people come in with hundreds of pages of lab results and saliva tests and all this stuff, and they've spent thousands of dollars on supplements and all this kind of stuff, and they're at the same place they were before they started and maybe feeling worse, it's hard not to say, look, we did our training in this, we go based on evidence-based medicine, and let's start from scratch kind of thing, and throw out all those supplements for the most part. I mean, some of them could be okay, but yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of people out there without a lot of evidence prescribing or selling a lot of things. Just like
Yeah.
that happens in the diet culture, all these diets and cleanses and all this stuff that people, maybe they work temporarily, maybe there's a placebo effect, but in the long run, could do more harm than good.
Completely, completely. I often find that if you sort of follow the money,
Yeah,
if somebody's trying to get you to pay for a product that they're selling, that it to me it's
it's a
always like a
conflict.
red flag. It's like there's a
Yeah,
flag there to at least like look deeper.
right.
What you mentioned about the blood tests and the 100 pages of lab results, are your sort of typical routine blood tests comprehensive enough to really understand what's going on with our hormones and our endocrine system?
I mean, we don't just run like a hormone panel, which I think is maybe where traditional academically trained endocrinologists differ from maybe like a integrative or holistic or whatever you want to call it, because we go based on signs and symptoms. So like I don't just do like a full hormone panel, but if someone comes in and says, they're tired or their menstrual cycle's off or things like that, I'll do blood tests that I think are relevant, but just kind of like throwing out a net for the hormones of people that don't have symptoms, I think is probably not indicated.
Right, right. Okay.
Like, well, going back to what we were saying before, like if someone feels good and the menstrual cycle is good, or the energy is good and blood sugar is good, all those things, I think overall I can be pretty positive in saying seems like the hormones are working. We don't
Yeah,
need to really dive deeper into that.
right, right. So I want to sort of circle back to a little bit like what we kind of discussed at the beginning of how you kind of got into this space more. Where does the idea of, health at every size, where did that kind of come from for you, and how do you then integrate that into your practice?
Yeah, I mean, it came a lot from, as I said, from Alexis and just reading her book and following her stuff on Instagram and whatever. And then just hearing from patients what their experience had been in healthcare and getting referrals from people that are treating eating disorders and specifically like emotional eating and things like that. And then the overlap between a lot of the endocrine stuff that we're talking about today on this episode, and just seeing it and hearing patients' experiences, and then realizing that I could do better and focusing on real true behaviors and not weight, because weight's not a behavior. I mean, I don't think I was ever, to be honest, like so focused on weight in my practice,
Mm-hmm.
but like I would probably just like the rest of us, trained to say like, well, if you lose weight or you cut out these carbs or these sweets, you'll be better off. And, gave that traditional advice and then realized that I don't necessarily need to do that to take care of people, and hopefully can do a better job by just focusing on adding in nutrients and things that we know are good for people, and really focusing on health promoting behaviors rather than subtracting things, because that tends to not work in the long run.
Right. Yeah. Instead of focusing on a restrictive mindset or trying to elicit a restrictive mindset in patients, to be more additive, more curious, and overall more beneficial for their well-being.
Yeah, because it's really difficult, I think, as humans to take away things that we enjoy, and maybe we shouldn't need to. And maybe it's a little easier to add in things and try doing things, whether it's like movement or different types of foods or whatever that we know are going to support us, and trying new things. And you said, being like curious and listening to ourselves and saying, oh wow, I did this walk, or I went swimming or whatever, and I enjoyed that. I'm going to do it again. Or I hated that and I'm going to try something else,
Yeah.
versus like I really like cookies, or I really like whatever behavior it is, I don't want to stop doing that. I mean, obviously within reason. I mean, if someone's like abusing alcohol or whatever, I'm not going to say like you should
Yeah.
continue
Go
to
for
do
it. Keep
that.
doing
But
that. Yeah.
yeah, but like within reason.
Yeah. Yeah. How do people typically come to find you or want to speak to an endocrine specialist? How do people know that that's what they need?
I think a lot of it probably comes from primary care doctors or other specialists. um but I think, now in the age that we're living in with social media and technology, and people can just look up symptoms and things like that. So I get a lot of people that are just curious to, that's what we're saying, just come in and check out their hormones and see what's going on, or maybe, they're tired or cycle's off or whatever's going on. And they come in, they just want to rule out or rule in things, and that happens.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what would you tell clinicians if you could about taking maybe a little bit of a different mindset around people's health as it pertains to, eating or restrictive eating or disordered eating or health at every size? Like, what do you wish that you could tell other clinicians?
I think it's really important not to make any assumptions about people's behaviors based on what they look like. I think that that's a common thing. And I think a lot of it is that we're really rushed in practice and we were trained, a certain way, and to be hyper vigilant on food and exercise and all these things. And I at least probably several times a week a patient tells me, who may be in a larger body, that a clinician told them, oh, you should consider diet and exercise and whatever the advice is, without actually asking them what they eat and how they move.
Right.
So that's really important. And I think that the other thing is, no matter what someone's body size is, across the size spectrum, everyone hopefully can benefit from health promoting behaviors. And just because someone's in, a smaller body doesn't mean they're getting movement or, eating adequate nutrition or fruits and vegetables and all these things. So we can all, no matter what size we are, benefit from stress management, sleep, and nutrition and things like that. And those are the behaviors. Weight's not the behavior, and weight, of course, may change as a result of those things. But focusing on weight potentially for a lot of people does more harm than good, and they avoid going to see the doctors because of it, and could make them feel bad about themselves, on and on and on. So that's why I
Yeah.
choose not to focus on it.
Yeah. I really like the phrase weight is not a behavior. I think that's actually really, really important and salient.
Yeah, 100% stole that from someone, but
Oh,
like
did
it's
you?
just
I'm like, I'm about to steal it from you.
no, I mean, I'm sure I saw it like somewhere on, someone's Instagram post, like when I first started doing this and like reading up on it and the research and posting on it and whatever. To me, that was like the line 100% that like made it click and like make sense. That's how I always explain it to people, because when you say it that way, it's like, you can't just wake up and say like, I'm going to change my weight today. If
Right.
that's the goal, which again, I'm not saying should be, but like, you can't wake up and say that. You can wake up and say, okay, I'm going to walk more today, or I'm going to, eat differently today, or whatever it may be. But you don't wake up and say, I'm going to change my blood pressure today. I'm going to change my blood sugar today, whatever. So weight's in that same category. And it's a marker. Like, it may go up or down depending on what's going on with the body, but that's not the behavior that you're looking to change or impact.
Right. It's a manifestation of behaviors. It's not a behavior.
Right. Like if someone has uncontrolled diabetes, they lose weight, because they're sick, and then
Yeah.
when the blood sugar gets controlled, they start gaining weight back. A lot of times as muscle and fat, and they're in a healthier state at that point. So, it can go up or down depending on what's going on with the body.
Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to ask you just a couple last questions. One is sort of if somebody knows that they have disordered eating or are struggling with food and they're worried about the impact that they've had on their body systems, what would you tell them?
I think go see even just a regular primary doctor and get some labs done and see what's going on. Certainly work with a team, specialists, dietitians, therapists, and wherever the body kind of ends up, that's what it is. And work in the present moment, and don't be hard on yourself if things happened in the past, and that's it. I think it's hard not to look back and maybe point the finger at yourself and things like that, but whatever's going on at the time, we do the best we can.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. That's great advice. Okay, I want to make sure that I don't let you go before asking where we can find you. So, websites, Instagrams, where are
So
all
the
of the
web
places?
Yeah, so the website is centralparkendocrinology.com. And I'm on Instagram, everything underscore endocrine, and Twitter I don't use as much, but at Dodell MD.
Perfect. Okay, well, we will make sure that we link all of those things in the show notes. And
Great.
I just wanted to thank you again so much for being here. This has been just like drinking out of a fire hose in terms of information. And it's just been so valuable to have you. So thank you again for being a guest.
Awesome. I hope people like it and get something out of it.